Hello, good people, and welcome to a very special episode of Off the Deep End. I'm your host, Braden Arbitrary Water Redacted, and I'm the Squall Leonhardt of this operation. 'Cause I just go ... whatever. Also joining me is the Cecil Fielder of this operation, Chris
Cecil.
Zombie Pie Redacted.
Well, if we're going to go with Cecil, then you have to use Squall's name from Kingdom Hearts.
Oh,
or
you
the
mean
name that
Leon.
it goes by. Yes, Leon. Everybody's favorite Kingdom Hearts character. Fighting
David
the
Boreanaz.
Heartless, leading the Heartless Resistance in the, what is it, Hollow Bastion Restoration Committee?
Radiant Garden.
Cool. Yes, all of these things are things that I'm not consulting a Wikipedia page.
I've never seen an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Angel, so all I know David Boreanaz from is Bones, and Bones is one of the worst cop procedural shows.
It's no Criminal Minds, let's just say.
It's no NCIS, even.
I would at least put it above Blue Bloods, though,
Yeah.
Braden.
But hark! Who is attacking us in a Magitech walker? Why, it's Adam Borg Master Redacted, the Biggs and Wedge of this operation.
Okay, yeah, that works. I was worried for a moment what I was going to be assigned, but yeah, no, Biggs and Wedge,
No, you're not Terra.
100%. No, that'd be kind of weird.
You're Biggs and Wedge. You die in the opening 10 minutes.
Yes, exactly.
Or you can be the Biggs and Wedge in, 7, who lasts a little longer.
Yeah,
An
or
admirable
7
fate.
remake,
Yeah.
who have more development on them.
Yeah. So, I have gathered you here today as a special episode to celebrate the rite of spring and our risen lord, Hironobu Sakaguchi, with a little side game in the Final Fantasy franchise, a Final Fantasy Gaiden, one might say. Final Fantasy Adventure for the Game Boy.
Wait, that Hironobu Sakaguchi, I think he made that really, really good, well-known video game, Blue Dragon,
Well,
right?
Yeah, the guy who
Yeah,
made Blue
Lost Odyssey.
Dragon.
Yeah, Lost
Yeah, the Lost Odyssey
too.
guy.
Yeah, the Fantasian man, very popular in the mobile space, less known in console games, and this is one of the mobile games that he helped make.
Mobile, portable.
Yeah. So before there were phones, there was something called a Game Boy. For those of you in the audience who are younger, below the age of 30. There used to be a thing called the Game Boy, and you would play Tetris on it, and then it would get dark, and you'd have to use the worm light, so you could still play it while your family was, driving through the night to visit your relatives in Spokane. And they made a Final Fantasy game for that. They made 4 of them.
Several.
Sure. Some of which it is debatable whether the progeny is Final Fantasy related or not Final Fantasy related, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, but I'm happy. I'm happy we're finally covering the Final Fantasy games on this podcast. People have been asking,
Not enough respect.
when is Off the Deep End going to cover a Final Fantasy game? When are you guys going to play the beloved JRPG franchise instead of all this obscure nonsense? Well, don't worry.
Yeah, we'll get to those.
We'll get to those. Please look forward to our Breath of Fire 3 podcast coming soon. That game's pretty good, actually. But in the meantime, we figured we'd take a little detour for the sake of Final Fantasy. So, who wants to explain Final Fantasy Adventure?
I guess I'll have a stab at it. I'm not going to get everything, and Braden and Borg, feel free to chime in. But Final Fantasy Adventure better known as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden, sometimes simplified as Seiken Densetsu, released in Europe as Mystic Quest, in the United States and most of North America, Final Fantasy Adventure, developed under the codename Gemma Knights, now is the initial title in the Mana franchise, not the Final Fantasy franchise. The Mana franchise was originally conceptualized and even to a certain degree predated Final Fantasy I, as the Seiken Densetsu trademark dates back to 1987 and was actually was supposed to be the full-fledged name for a project that was titled The Emergence of Excalibur, which was initially supposed to come out for the Famicom Disk System. So much so that they advertised this game, took pre-orders for this game, and even advertised it as being a quote, unprecedented 5 floppy disk game, which would have made it the largest title developed for the Famicom Disk System
5
up
floppy
to that
disks?
point. Due to technical problems and also just like the game being way too ambitious for the Famicom Disk System, which, let's just say, was not selling all that great, although it kind of sort of had its own niche within domestic video game console players in Japan. They canceled it, refunded all of those orders. Yet, the funny thing is that when they canceled that project, Seiken Densetsu, or The Emergence of Excalibur, they sent out a letter of apology with full refunds for the people who pre-ordered the game and advised them to play a similar game that was coming out called Final Fantasy. So it was, weirdly enough, a failed project that predated Final Fantasy, then was revived because Square continued to renew the trademark for a game called Seiken Densetsu. Then in 1990, a guy by the name of Koichi Ishii was given the opportunity to do a spin-off series within Final Fantasy called Gemma Knights. He was given the directive that this game that you're working on must come out for the Game Boy. And we're not talking about the Game Boy Color. We're talking about OG Game Boy. So 1990 rolls around. The game is finally repackaged in Japan as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden. As we already kind of talked about it, the game has many names. In the United States, it is called Final Fantasy Adventure. It is the first title in the Mana series. I'm spending a lot of time talking about the weird progeny. Gameplay-wise, this is very similar to The Legend of Zelda for the NES. It has an overview. It utilizes top-down camera angles. The game is divided into squares where, upon entering and finding the exits of the screen that you are presently on, it just pans over to the next square. There is an overview map system. There are individual towns within the world that you're exploring. You have to collect experience points, gold coins, items. But the big capstone for your progress are dungeon areas, very, again, similar to Legend of Zelda. That said, the improvement that this game makes upon the Legend of Zelda format is not only can you save at any point, you progress stats, which include hit points, power, stamina, and even magic. So this game has a, let's say, more traditional leveling system to, say, The Legend of Zelda 2, which we have played for this podcast. The stat progression is pretty straightforward. If you level up one of the magic aligned stats, you'll either get stronger, more potent spells or larger pools of magic points to expend on spells. The good news is that you kind of don't need to worry about progressing your character poorly, because no matter what, the other stats that you did not select will go up. It just is dependent on what you picked. And some of these meters that you deal with are pretty straightforward, like HP, magic points. There is a stamina meter, which utilizes and is how you access special attacks. It's really dependent on how many times you do attack. That gauge will fill up over time, no matter what, but it fills up faster if you level up your character to align it more towards dexterity, or what we would call dexterity, but stamina. There are special attacks with every ability. But the only other thing that's really there with the mechanics is normally there is a guest system. There's a guest character system. Usually you have one non-player character tagging along with you with varying degrees of usefulness therein. But you're not always going to have the ability to have a guest character. And you can kill townspeople, but don't do that.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to see the ways this deviates from the main series Final Fantasy franchise. Because, when I wanted to pick a Final Fantasy game for this podcast, I wasn't expecting this here. This game predates Link's Awakening as well, by the way.
This game predates Link to the Past by a few months.
Indeed. I think that
there
it's
is not
important.
A chocobo in this.
I thought that there were chocobos, but
that later in the game, because
later in the game, and some of the enemies and NPC designs are just completely directly lifted from Final Fantasy 1 in
there's
particular.
A guy who just has the red mage sprite.
But we're gonna kind of like mention this over and over again. 1991. And on the Game Boy. So everything that we talk about has really that in mind. This is a device that has a CPU that's measured in megahertz. Anything above that. This is an LCD screen that is 160 by 144. It utilizes 4 AA batteries. It is novel in what it can do, especially within the context of when it was made. But in hindsight, we really do need to just communicate. This is a game that does a lot with very little.
Yes, and talking about how little there is, for all the younger listeners, the Game Boy is running off of 4 megahertz. It's not the hundreds of megahertz like a 20-year-old computer. We're talking about 4. That's like
1 megahertz per AA battery.
Yes, so this is like an early 80s computer setup here. There's 2 colors on the screen. It's you have black and white, or you have like light green and dark green. There's the character limit on screen is very constricting. You can't do a whole lot with the screen, with the processor, with the battery life. And there's an A and B button and a start and select, and that's all you have for input. So doing anything is an achievement almost on this system. Well, anything other than Tetris.
Yeah, that's the big thing is maybe Pokemon took away its shine at the end of that device's lifespan, but let us not forget that when we use the term system seller, Tetris is the doyen example of what is a system seller. We can talk about Mario 64. We can talk about any of the games that Borgmaster has analyzed for the PlayStation 1, Sega Saturn, but the gold standard of a system seller game is Tetris. It still is. People waited in lines to get the Game Boy just to play Tetris. And for many people, that was all they played on the Game Boy for years. And it moved units, and it's part of the reason why the competition for the Game Boy, whether it be the Game Gear, the Lynx, or the Turbo Express, and much later, near the end of the handheld's lifespan, the Wonder Swan. But yeah, Tetris is a big deal. And so there's a sizable user base with the Game Boy. There's a desire to make things for the Game Boy. So everybody's going to have a go at all of the console and maybe even PC genre standbys with this device with a mixed success, let's say. We've played one handheld RPG, or just a few, right? We played Lord Banif's Deceit and then also Biomotor Unitron.
Yeah, I
You really got to love the Neo Geo Pocket Color.
yeah, as the world's foremost Neo Geo Pocket Color enthusiast, I'm always thinking about our time with Biomotor Unitron and just wondering how come this game isn't like Biomotor Unitron. And that extends to this game, Final Fantasy Adventure, a Final Fantasy game in the Final Fantasy franchise. For some reason it's in a collection on the Switch with like two other video games that have a different name for some reason. I don't know what's up with that. But what impresses me about this game is the way that it tackles its own scale and scope for a handheld. It does not try to overreach its boundaries like those unfortunate Castlevania games for the original Game Boy.
That very bad Mortal Kombat Game Boy game.
Yes, I have that Castlevania collection with all of the classic games. And if you want a bad time, I highly recommend playing the Game Boy one.
The last thing that I would want to say about the Game Boy and Final Fantasy Adventure's place in that library, something that that people have to wrap their minds around these days is the Game Boy's lifespan was like 10 years, like 89 to 98. Like Pokemon, the Pokemon Red, Pokemon Blue, Pokemon Yellow, that came out in the US in 1998. Final Fantasy Adventure was in 1991.
They also didn't stop making them until like 2000.
And Tetris was 1989. So you had 2 full years between the launch of the system and Adventure, which that would be pretty well into a lifespan for most other systems. But it was 7 years between this and Pokemon. So if this seems, a bit more primitive than Pokemon or, the Game Boy Color games, just know it's most of a decade in between the two. Yeah. And there's not a ton within that time period. When you go and look it up, there's maybe a handful of notable games per year released for the Game Boy, and then just tons of trash.
Or ported down versions of mainstream console games.
And very few of those port downs are good. Like, the best games for the Game Boy are games that were designed with it in mind. And say what you will about Super Mario Land, but it is better than most of the platformers that came out for that handheld.
So Final Fantasy Adventure, being one of the few good to decent Game Boy games, puts it in like the top 5%, top 3% of games for the system. So whatever we say about how primitive it is or any complaints we might have about the design, remember, this is one of the best games on the system, of a system that was around for 10 years.
Sure. And part of the reason why it was so good is that the team that worked on this game was, let's just say, stacked. So the Final Fantasy Adventure team was mostly led by a guy by the name of Koichi Ishii, who is not only the person who worked on this game, but is widely considered the creator of the Mana franchise in general. His legacy is unfortunately
what's a Mana?
His legacy is unfortunately mostly tied to his work on Final Fantasy XI. He is the original director of Final Fantasy XI and was a stalwart and vocal advocate for a lot of what we would call its archaic game design, whether it be it's an open sandbox with very little direction to it, and he was a very huge vocal advocate for the game enforcing its EXP penalty system, where upon character death, as we said during the Final Fantasy XI podcast, you would lose experience points and possibly lose entire levels. Nonetheless, here his previous works were working on all of the Final Fantasy games up to that point, 1, 2, and 3, as well as being like the graphic designer for those games, and including Final Fantasy the Legend, the Final Fantasy Legend. And so this is his first kind of go at being a director, and you know what? He shot his shot, and I would say he made it.
Yeah. I've never heard of these Mana games. Is that like a Live Alive sort of thing where it only came out in Japan?
Mana games, they're kind of like the Tales games, aren't they?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're
okay.
Tales knockoffs, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. That makes more sense.
This is also a very early credit to Yoshinori Kitase. He was, I believe, with the design team. So he's going to be the person that worked on the game's script. And, you know, the term scripting means not just the scenario work, but like the actual structure of the world and how do you handle transitioning from one screen to the next. That's kind of his work on this game. But yeah, it's a game that does a lot. It even has a story, right, Braden?
Yes. So, you know, this is before Final Fantasy games even had real stories, outside of, like, 2, I guess. So it's really impressive to see them putting, a fairly in-depth story about a hero who you name and a girl who you name defending this mana tree from the evil forces of the Dark Lord.
This game has the audacity to name its villain Dark Lord. And that's his name.
Sir Dark Lord to you.
Because, yes, they call him Sir Dark Lord, which means his first name is Dark and his last name is Lord.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Predating the isekai trend.
Also, I'm going to interject just to do so.
Ooh.
This came out in the U.S. the same month as Final Fantasy IV.
Ooh. I gotta say, I mean, we'll talk about it. The parts that I did not like about this game, I feel are indicative of the technology. And also the design of RPGs at the time. Is there anything that this game does that is novel and new that is a complete failure? I don't know. I don't think any of its new and in fact, I think that all of its new and novel game design quirks are actually helpful. Like, it was merciful being able to save on the fly. Sure, the limitation is 2 slots that you have to overwrite constantly, but games just flat out did not let you do that. The leveling system being pretty straightforward and having like wiggle room and novel ways in which you can see the improvements to your character in real time. Pretty cool, let alone for the fact that it's on a small little handheld that has 4 megahertz at its disposal.
And it's a game that could be measured in kilobytes.
Yeah, just pretty cool for what it does. And it even compares favorably to games that Nintendo, which had really figured out the DNA to this device that they had made. I mean, I thought I had more fun playing this than Metroid 2, by far.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not saying much.
It's just, like I said, and we'll kind of talk about it. I think that it wears its traditional JRPG, and this is where Final Fantasy is still very much rooted in pulling inspiration from AD&D, Wizardry, and Ultima. Like, those are the parts of this game that kind of don't work for me. I don't know. How did you all feel about like the things that were like niggling nitpicks?
As far as nitpicks go, the boss design is it continues the worst impulses from Zelda, the original Zelda. You know, you have big bosses and small rooms. You don't have a lot of room to maneuver. blocking is inconsistent. So you just end up tanking hits, and it's more of a supply check than anything else. But that's par for the course, and because of the limitations on the system, the boss patterns are straightforward, pretty easy to figure out. So you won't bang your head against it too much, go unsupplied. It's also interesting that there's a world map for what it is, and it has the implicit promise of being a big open world like Legend of Zelda. But once you play through it for a few hours, you realize it's kind of linear. You have, semi-open zones that lead to towns or dungeons, and those towns or dungeons lead to the next semi-open zone. And you just kind of like go around counterclockwise in this world map that way. A way that isn't fully open like Link's Awakening would be 2 years later on the system. Even then, this is a really solid half step going from, The Legend of Zelda to Link to the Past, which came out after this game. Plus some Ease progression stuff in there as well. So it's Legend of Zelda and Ease put together, paired all the way down to the basics.
My only thing that I would add, Borgmaster, is that the boss fights and even like the general encounters that require, if not outright necessitate the use of magic, are so much worse in comparison to the ones that allow more of a, let's say, omnivore diet or a mixture of like physical attacks and magic. Like,
oh yeah, definitely. The part where I bounced off the game, I guess, spoiler for that. It's the first room you get to that have enemies who can turn you into a Moogle, and the Moogle stats effect drops your defense down to 0. So I got turned into a Moogle, and then like 2 frames later was hit with an attack and insta killed. So this isn't a flawless experience by any measure.
Yeah, it's I wouldn't say it's a super difficult game, but it's hard in the way that a lot of old games are hard, in that sometimes if you don't have enough healing items to just tank through things, you're gonna take damage because the screens are small and it's not the most reactive video game. And sometimes the hitboxes on the weapons are a little wonky. I found myself mostly using the chain flail, but there's also a sword, an axe, and a sickle, all of which give you different traversal abilities. So, like, the axe cuts down trees, the sickle cuts plants, and the flail is basically a hook shot. Once again, this is before Link's Awakening, Link to the Past. So maybe Zelda ripped this off,
Oh no.
Yeah. I think it's really strange how they made 3 Final Fantasy games up to this point, and this is the fifth one, because they also made Final Fantasy Legend. Excuse me.
And again, this came out the same time as Final Fantasy IV.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like
such a
sixth
different
one.
game. I'm genuinely surprised they didn't make another menu-based RPG, but I guess it's fine because this works so well for the console it's on. Like, if I was a child and given this game, I think I'd really enjoy it. But also, this game came out before I was born.
Oh man, don't date me like this. Don't date me like this.
So as someone who played this as a child, how was your experience?
It was a little bit of a trip down memory lane because I'm nearing where when I played this as a kid, I basically bounced off. In fact, spoilers, the part with the Moogles is actually where I bounced off as a kid, because that's where I said, you know what? I think I just want to play Mario Land on this device. I don't know. Pokemon. Yeah, like there are the parts to this game that I also feel like are not necessarily self-sabotaging is are the times when you have to kind of rely on your companions. There's an early dungeon where you don't have your first offensive magic ability, and you have to rely on a companion that is a red mage. And getting him to aim his fire spell and actually use it where you want it to go is such a colossal pain in the ass.
I thought it was random.
It is random.
Okay.
I think that you can push him in the right direction by facing the enemies, but I think the documentation based off of game FAQs is, let's say, a mix in terms of whether or not that actually has any impact. Another thing that Borgmaster pointed out, defending against offensive stuff that comes your way, I guess maybe the shield does do something, but only if you have enough stamina. But sometimes you're just needing to clear out rooms quickly that your stamina meter just expends itself too quickly for you to actually see the cool stuff that you want to do often. And even then, when you have a full stamina meter, getting those special abilities is a bit randomized as well. Sometimes you'll get it immediately with a full bar, sometimes you won't. And that's a little frustrating. And the AI in this game is a reflection of the limited technology that this game was working with. The bosses are the clearest example of that, but also the enemies just don't seem to know where you are and just go on their own little paths. And that's both a good and a bad, because once you get stuck in a corner, that can go real south for you real quick.
Yeah, it ends up being a common strategy is if you enter a screen and the enemy placement's bad, you just immediately exit the screen and re-enter to get a new random roll on the placement.
I think that's good. Teaching kids speedrun strats at an early age.
Yeah, and going back to the limitations of the system, even just the second boss fight against the vampire who shoots bats out of his cape at you, which is something you don't see in any other game ever. If you're on the same horizontal as the boss, it can't draw both you, the boss, and the bat sprites all at the same time, so the bats are invisible or flicker in and out of existence real fast, which is unideal if you're trying to dodge.
This also points out something. You can get bumped or pushed when you take a hit. So as I learned the hard way, when you fight that vampire guy, you can get bumped into the previous screen, and that just resets the boss battle completely.
Yeah, the double-headed dragon did that to me.
It's kind of a bummer, but also, what are you going to do? I did also notice that, like, it's not just the bosses, it's all of the enemies. You'll just be in the process of trying to walk up and hit an enemy, and it'll just flicker out of existence because the game just can't handle having you do these attacks, your companion shooting out spells, and display the moving enemy that you're trying to hit. But even then, it's like, let's not pretend that like the Famicom didn't have issues with flickering and like overloading the screen with too much information.
Yeah, so this is very much of its era in that way. But even with all those issues, it's still a relatively fast experience. If you get done over dirty in a combat encounter, as long as you save, you're not gonna go back too far, and you can just power through pretty quickly. It's not a long game. The pace is pretty good. Even a hard boss fight, you're not gonna be stuck on it for too long. Maybe 1 to 3 attempts. So it really moves, which is nice.
Yeah, it doesn't have any cruft.
No. I mean, it doesn't have cruft because it can't
fit it on
the space
cartridge
to have the cruft.
Well, they hadn't figured it out by then how to fit cruft on the space. They figured it out by the time Pokemon came out.
By the time Pokemon came out, they figured out how to fit cruft onto a cartridge. Crufterid Super Cruft chip.
The Cruft Boy.
You know how Nintendo. You know how Iwata was a super good coder and was able to, help make Pokemon Gold and Silver have the Kanto region. That was cruft coding.
Yeah.
Cruftology.
But you have named characters and NPCs that actually speak to you. Game starts out with, hey, this game even has cutscenes, which I was even surprised by. So there's like this basic storyline where it just drops you into your first kind of encounter in a small arena where you have to fight, I think, a giant bear or wolf or lion thing. And you basically learn pretty quickly that you are a prisoner of the Dark Lord, Sir Dark Lord, and you're employed to be a gladiator, and slowly over time you learn about the resistance front against the Dark Lord, and that the Dark Lord wants to do something to a mana tree. And as you learn more and more about this world, you get the general gist of the template of this franchise that would later get refined in future games.
So when you say over time, we're talking about 5 minutes.
Yeah, like these cutscenes are novel for this, but let us make no mistake, these cutscenes are oftentimes 10 to 15 seconds, and they are weird creative ways to like direct you into the next location.
Yes, I just want to say this episode is dedicated to Billy. Rest in peace. He was a real one. Telling us about the mana tree.
Yeah, there was also Willie, our friend, at the start of the game.
Oh, Willie. I thought that was Billy, not Willie.
No.
It is Willie. Okay.
But yeah, there's a guy named Julius who's here to just mess you up and make your life miserable. You have to try and stop the Dark Lord from messing up this tree.
There's a female character who you name.
And turns out to be a big deal.
She's the MacGuffin.
Yeah, it turns out she's the MacGuffin.
For the mana tree.
Thank you to her for healing me when she was a companion. She's a real big MVP of my playthrough so far. But spoilers, when you get to the end of the game, which I just read up as a reference, turns out that the mana tree is actually dying. You have to kill the Dark Lord. You kill the Dark Lord. And it turns out that our good friend, our heroine, is a descendant of a person who is the mana tree. And her mother, who is the mana tree, is dying. And she has to take her place in being reborn as a giant tree. And the hero is her guardian.
Fellas, if your girl needs to become a tree to save the world, maybe get yourself a different girl.
Hey, I thought this was a no kink shame zone.
Listen, I'm sorry I've exposed you in your dryad fixation.
I like watching Fauna. She's one of my favorite VTubers.
How dare get her name out of your goddamn mouth.
What? She's a dryad too.
No, she's a Kirin. VTubers. Anyways.
This game is quaint. Is it mean to call it quaint?
Little action RPG.
Is it mean to like pat it on its head, ruffle its hair, and say, "Oh, aren't you adorable?" But that's how I feel about this game.
I mean, compare it to the other two portable RPGs we've played. I'd say it's better than both of those.
Whoa. Bob Motor Unitron is a classic.
It's fine.
I'll take Bob Motor Unitron over this game any day of the week.
Well, gents, are we just jumping into it? I thought okay. Any final words about
Final Fantasy Adventure?
Seiken Densetsu Mana 1.
Final Fantasy Gaiden.
Mana 1? Final Fantasy Adventure. I've heard of this.
Yeah. Any last words?
I like the part where you get new equipment, and that new equipment lets you navigate the world. It reminded me of East, but not as good.
I was going to say that the two-headed dragon boss fight and the minecart section reminded me of Virtual Highlight.
All right.
Nothing but the best comparisons. All right, let's get to ranking. Remember, you can follow us and the rank at bit.ly/OTDE rank. All right, so let's start. At guideline right here. Currently, at the top is Might and Magic 6: The Mandate of Heaven, Suikoden the First, and Xenosaga the First. At the bottom three, we've got Aiden Chronicles the First Mage, N64 Classic, Unlimited Saga.
Clearly a better console than the SNES.
We can't get into that here. We cannot get into that here. Dan Reichert is a professionally wrong. And at the bottom, much like Dan Reichert's opinions, is Hoshiwo Mirohito, which is a poor piece of software. All right, so where do you think we start? Hybrid Heaven?
Yeah, I was gonna say that the ceiling for this game is going to be 22, which is below Biomotor Unitron.
Do we want to just put it up against Biomotor Unitron? Wait, what's above Biomotor Unitron?
Megami Tensei 1.
Ugh, I don't know if I think it's better than Megami Tensei, but I think there's a debate to be had if it's better than Biomotor Unitron.
I mean,
It's
I
not.
like it more than Biomotor Unitron.
It's not better than Biomotor Unitron.
Oh, I have to be Kingmaker.
So
All right, I'll hear the arguments to both sides. Braden, go first.
This game is better than Biomotor Unitron because it's trying to do less, and it
It
succeeds
is breezier.
at doing less.
Yeah, I think you're overstating that. Biomotor Unitron is not a long game, but I take everything else that you're saying in advisement. Org.
Biomotor Unitron is a better game because all of the systems are better. It plays better. It looks better. Some of those avatars are hot.
You like the fish people?
Yeah, the fish people.
Okay.
It's better. It's better in every way. Really, Biomotor Unitron.
My only problem with Biomotor Unitron, though, is that the actual you're basically just doing the same two attacks per every battle that you end up unlocking, and the build path for Biomotor Unitron is pretty straightforward. Nonetheless, we got two very breezy. We can all agree that these are two very good games at the very least.
They're two very good, perfect for when you are on a road trip across the United States of America.
And
in your parents' Suburban.
This both of these games to me highlight why I do genuinely miss handheld gaming. These are bite-sized chunks, things that you can pick up and play. They're meant to be played in short bursts rather than long play sessions. I miss this era of gaming. I miss this type of gaming. And even with the rise of the Steam Deck, even with the, ubiquity of the Switch, this type of portable gaming still feels as if it's dead. I have to actually give the nod to Biomotor Unitron, but only by a hair. I feel like that game has a few more mechanics going in its favor, even though and fewer rough edges overall. Nonetheless, this is still I would recommend this game. If you've never played a Game Boy game, you should still probably play Link's Awakening. This is a good second place.
Yeah.
Also play the Final Fantasy Legend, so you can get started on the Saga franchise.
The what?
What's
the
a Saga
franchise? It says Final Fantasy in the title.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. The spiritual predecessor to the Saga franchise.
And what does this talk about? How this isn't an actual Final Fantasy game? That this isn't leading into a franchise.
It says Final Fantasy right in the name.
Doesn't this game lead to Cloud and Squall, the people that Braden referenced? This is the Final Fantasy.
Yeah, this
game.
is a Final Fantasy game.
Yeah, there's a Dark Lord, just like in Final Fantasy 3, where you have the the darkness. You see?
Yeah.
Oh man. Oh man. Gino's gonna kill us.
He's going to really love when I send him this podcast completely unaware. He's like, you played a Final Fantasy game? Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. All right.
Real talk. Would Final Fantasy... I think we've had this discussion before. You two, being people who are not on that podcast, I think Final Fantasy Legends has actually been disqualified. I think Jeff is the one that says they're not Final Fantasy games. Absolutely not.
I mean, Final Fantasy's right there in the name.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But are you going to say that Crystal Chronicles isn't a Final Fantasy game?
Oh man, putting down
Is Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon not a Final Fantasy game?
That's
it's
a good
mystery
point.
dungeon game. It has chocobos in it.
Gino has actually proposed that we play Mystery Dungeon. Chocobo Mystery Dungeon. Chocobo Racing even.
I mean, if you're going to play any Mystery Dungeon, play Tornico Mystery Dungeon, because Tornico is the best Dragon Quest character.
You really like the merchant, don't you?
Hey, that was like the most interesting part of Dragon Quest IV.
Look forward to our next episode where we cover Dragon Quest VII.
Yeah, please look forward to our coverage of Dragon Quest VII.
That's going to need to be a multi-part episode. That's just
2036.
that's just the crew descending into madness.
It's just
with each installment.
being like, wow, well, we're still stuck on the intro 30 hours in.
All right, so is Final Fantasy Adventure better than Risen?
Yeah,
I've
probably.
already said yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd rather play this game than Risen. It's already on the list. Don't worry about it. But I think that wraps it up for us for this very special Gaiden portable-sized episode of Off the Deep End. Definitely not something we came up with because of April Fools and because
Don't
we
look
needed
at the
an
date
extra
this
podcast for the
came
week.
out.
April Fools, what's that? People are listening to this in the year 2027.
That's right.
I have no idea what we're talking about.
No, of course not. Listen, as far as you know, it's April 4th or later.
Mm-hmm.
So, don't worry about it.
We had a good time.
We had a good time. Thanks to Supersex 420 for our theme song, Halfway. You can find them on Bandcamp. Remember to support the Patreon. You can give us $3 American to suggest a game of the role-playing variety, as long as it maybe even games with Final Fantasy in the title. Who's to say? No one can stop us. And finally, I'd like to thank both ZP and Borgmaster for coming here and talking into microphones with me. I have been Arbitrary Water, and remember, there's no such thing as cheating in a single-player game. And what's a mana? What is that? Bye.